When I started at the newspaper here, I was the publisher of the newspaper. When I started my first day, I wanted to make sure that I made a great impression on my boss. And so I had a meeting with him that afternoon. And so before the meeting, I did everything I could do to prepare. I went and I read a lot of information, and I took notes, and I prepared an agenda, and I was ready. And so when the time came for me to go talk to him, I got up, and I was on my way to his office, but standing in my door was my boss. I was a little taken aback. I said, I was just coming to see you for our meeting. He goes, I know, I'm coming to see you. He said, have a seat. So I sat down behind the desk, and he sat down in front of my desk. And I had the agenda there, so I prepared to dive into the agenda. And before I could say anything, he says to me, so how's your daughter doing? And I said, oh, she's great. At this time, she was a little younger. I said, we found a great child care place here in Norfolk we're very happy with, and she's great, and she's taken the move really well. And then I went back to my agenda, and I was about to restart, and he said, so how's your wife doing? I said, she's doing well as well. I said, she's adjusting to, she's a New Jersey girl. I bought a New Jersey girl south of Maryland. Let me tell you, I had to make a lot of promises for that one. But she adjusted to being down here, and I proceeded to tell him about her. And then I looked back at my agenda, and I began to dive in. And she said, and he immediately cut across me again. He said, well, have you found a house? The moral of the story is 45 minutes passed, and I never got to the agenda. But I was convinced after that meeting that my boss really cared about me, really understood me, and was going to do everything he could to build a great relationship with me. And it was a teaching moment for me that I have tried to live into since that day. And the moment and the lesson is this. I know you've been working hard in school, and you're going to tonight receive your associates in science and your associates in arts and certificates. The most enduring asset, though, that you will have will be your ability to understand and relate to people. That will be the muscle that you should concentrate on the most. Every place I've been, every job I've done, every person I've talked to, every country I've been to, at the end of the day, the game changer in getting things done, in making progress, really comes down to how well people understand and relate to and respect and listen to and work with people. And let me tell you, you can be the most brilliant fill-in-the-blank, lawyer, college president, forgive me, anybody else, but if you cannot get along with people, if you cannot figure out how to get things done with people, very few people are going to follow you. And so my boss, yep, you can clap for that for sure. I'm still trying to live into that. And it's a muscle that you can never develop too much. I'm always amazed, in today's world, what we hear is you've got to master technology. And don't get me wrong, you do have to master technology. But when I hire someone, I never ask them about the technology they've mastered. And when I'm asking them questions, I'm never trying to figure out whether they can code or not. At the end of the day, I'm trying to figure out whether this person can be a great teammate. It's all about people. That's the first story. I was raised by my grandparents about 2.5 hours west of here in a town of 1,200 people. My town is smaller than your class. My daughter always teases me about this. She says, "Boy, you are a country bumpkin," and she's right. I was a tobacco farmer growing up. I tell people all the time, if you want to inspire somebody to go to college, you put them in the tobacco field. That boy or that young lady will be in school the very next day. It's hard work. My grandparents, who raised me, I went to live with them when I was 50. My grandfather, because he was African American, living in a small town in the South, born in 1914, did not have access to schools. He went to school in a barn for 6 years, about a mile below our house. And then he got out of that barn and he went out into the woods and he started cutting trees, cutting pulpwood, raising tobacco, raising pigs and corn and all the rest. Eventually, he built a house right next to his mother's, and he eventually erected his own sawmill, and he became the first African American in that whole region of Southside Virginia who had a sawmill business. And for 44 years, he ran that sawmill. He was the most powerful influencer in my life. I should say it another way. He remains, he's dead now, the most powerful influence on my life. And by far, the most potent relationship I've ever had. Well, when he was 85, he became very ill. A bacteria entered his right eye and traveled down his optic nerve and got into the membrane around the brain, the meninges. He had bacterial meningitis. The ambulance came and picked him up and rushed him to the hospital. He had to be taken down to the Medical College of Virginia in Richmond. And I met him there in the emergency room. This was a man that I would have died for. We were that close. And I went in, and the doctors pulled me aside, and they said, "Listen, your grandfather has bacterial meningitis. If he were 45, I'd tell you he's not going to survive." He said, "We have no documented cases of 85-year-olds surviving bacterial meningitis. And so I need to prepare you for your grandfather's death." And I looked at him and I said, "Well, is there anything you can do, doctor?" And he said, "The only thing we can do is to give him an antibiotic, and the rest is up to him." He said, "But I'll tell you what's going to happen." He said, "We're going to put him in intensive care, and your grandfather is going to slowly creep off into a comatose state. And then we'll see what happens." And I said, "Okay." And sure enough, he went into intensive care, and just like the doctor described, my grandfather became non-responsive. And they had to put a breathing tube down his throat so he could breathe, and they had to give him medication so his heart rate would stabilize. and they had to do all things to keep his vital organs alive, so to speak. And they said, we'll see what happens. And I said, well, can I stay with him? And I was there in intensive care with him. And I said a prayer, and I just sat there, and I dozed off to sleep. And the doctors came in that night, and they awakened me, and they said, listen, we don't want to give you any false hope, but we think we should remove that eye that bacteria was in. Said, that's where the bacteria now is living, and we need to see what we can do. And I said, look, if there's a chance, let's do it. And so they removed his right eye that night. They brought him back in, and there we were. And hours passed, and I'm sitting there beside him, and the nurses are tending to him. And something moved me to call his name. This is a man who had been in a coma now for hours. And I called his name, and he responded. I said, Grandpa? He said, huh? And the nurse looked at me, and she said, did you say something? I said, no, that was my grandfather. I said, you better go get that doctor. So she ran and got the doctor, and the doctor came in, and the doctor examined him, and the doctor looked at me, and the doctor said, I can't explain this to you medically, but your grandfather looks like he's going to pull through. And sure enough, after time, they began to remove all these artificial devices that were keeping my grandfather alive. And my grandfather started coming back to life. I could tell in his appearance. And finally, he opened his eyes, and I went to him. I got next to him, and I said, Gramps, I said, I knew you were a tough country boy, but I said, you gave us a real scare there. And he looked up at me, could barely talk because his throat was sore from that tube that had been down. And he looked at me and he said, boy, he said, anybody who tells you they don't want to live until they're 86, he said, they ain't 85 yet. I said, that's probably right. And then I remembered I let them take his eye the night before. What do I do about that? So I ran to the doctor. I said, Doc, what do we do about the eye? The doctor looked at me. He said, I've done my job. I went back to my grandfather, and I sat down beside him. I said, Gramps, I said, you were very, very sick. And I said, the only thing that we could think of was to remove your eye because you had gotten an infection in your eye, and we needed to take it out. And he looked up at me. He didn't pause. He didn't blink, nothing. He said, boy, that's okay. I couldn't see out of that eye anyway. He lived for 10 more years. He taught me a lesson in that intensive care unit that I have tried to remember every day. 2 lessons. One is you've got to live life with optimism. Optimism. And that's up to you. That's a choice that we have to make. He went through a lot, discriminated against because of his color and couldn't go to school. So what did he do? He went out into the woods and he started cutting trees. That sawmill that I told you about, it burned in front of our eyes after 44 years. All of his blood, sweat, and tears, and we couldn't afford insurance. The next day, he got up and he took crops out of our garden and drove down the road and started selling them to our neighbors. He had this optimism. No matter what happened, his view was, this is just part of the journey. And the other thing, the other lesson for me in that intensive care unit that has really come in handy and that I hope will be handy for you is out of all the things we need in life, out of all the muscles or the attributes or the character traits that we need to really, really focus on, arguably one of the most important is resilience. We're going to have bad days, folks. We're going to win some and we're going to lose some. And some may be close to death-defying. The important thing is that we bounce back. That's the important thing. There are going to be good seasons and there are going to be bad. The real test for us is we got to bounce back. If we can bounce back, we'll be all right. We'll be all right. And based on what I know of your class and what I just heard from your classmate, I know that you all have already had resilience-building experiences. Draw on them. There'll be more tough times ahead. There'll be more things that you aspire to that won't come your way. At the end of the day, you don't need that eye anyway. Congratulations to you.